Today's episode of the 6Ps podcast, as we delve back into our comparative unit, is going to be on the Dressmaker and a guided reading of Chapter 1. So with our areas for comparison, we looked at these last time, but these are sort of, I guess, the 12 areas that we're going to focus on. And in Chapter 1, the main three are going to be the idea of insular communities and conservative communities, and the ideas and themes of blame and guilt. So let's get into it. And this is the prologue. So this is the 2 pages that come before Chapter 1. Travellers crossing the wheat yellow plains to Dungatar would first notice a dark blot shimmering at the edge of the flatness. Further down the asphalt, the shape would emerge as a hill. On top of the hill sat a shabby brown weatherboard leaning provocatively on the grassy curve. It looked as if it was about to careen down, but was roped to a solid chimney by thick-limbed wisteria. When passengers approaching Dungatar by train felt the carriage warp around the slow southward curve, they glanced up through the window and saw the tumbling brown house. At night, light from the house could be seen from the surrounding plains, a shaky beacon in a vast black sea, winking from the home of Mad Molly. As the sun set, the hill cast a shadow over the town that stretched as far as the silos, and this is quite symbolic. We know that Molly and Tilly live in this house, and the way that they've been treated and the lack of respect they receive from the town is that shadow that hangs over them. And we know that Tilly eventually seeks revenge on them. So one winter night, Myrtle Dunnage, who is our protagonist, searched for the light from her mother's house through the windscreen of a Greyhound bus. Recently she'd written to her mother, but when she received no reply, she summoned the courage to phone. The curt voice at the telephone exchange had said, "Molly Dunnage hasn't had a phone on for years. She wouldn't know what a phone was." "I wrote," said Tilly. "She didn't reply. Perhaps she didn't get my letter." "Old man Molly wouldn't know what to do with a letter either," came the retort. And Tilly decided she would go back to Dungatar. And we know that Molly is continuously referred to by the villagers as Mad Molly. And this is what spurs her on to visit her hometown. So as we know, this text is broken up into 4 sections. The first one is named after the fabric gingham, which, as I've written there, is inexpensive yet adaptable and versatile. And it leads to, or relates to, Tilly's return home to Dungatar. Chapter 1 sees Tilly reunite with her mother. Sergeant Farrett patted his policeman's cap, picked a thread from his lapel, and saluted his neat reflection. He strode to his shiny police car to begin his evening drive around, knowing all was well. The locals were subdued and the men asleep, for there was a chance of victory the next day on the football field. He stopped his car in the main street to peruse the buildings, silver-roofed and smoky. Fog tiptoed around them, gathering around gateposts and walls, standing like gossamer marquees between trees. Muffled conversation wandered from the station hotel. He studied the vehicles nosing the pub. The usual Morris Minors and the Austins, a utility, Councillor Pettyman's, Rosalie, and the Beaumont's imposing but tired Triumph Gloria. And we know that this is a town that is very much one of routine. A Greyhound bus rumbled and hissed to a standstill outside the post office, its headlights illuminating Sergeant Farrett's pale face. "A passenger," he said aloud. The question mark suggests that passengers or people don't often visit Dungatar. That, again, highlights the fact that it is quite an isolated, insular community. The door of the bus swung open and the glow from the interior beam struggled out. A slim young woman stepped lightly into the fog. Her hair was lush about her shoulders, and she wore a beret and an unusually cut overcoat. Very smart, thought the sergeant. The driver pulled a suitcase from the luggage boot and carried it to the post office porch, leaving it in the dark corner. He went back for another, then another, and then he pulled something else out, something with a domed cover with Singer printed in gold letters across its side. That, of course, is Tilly's sewing machine. The passenger stood holding it, looking over to the creek, then up and down the street. "Oh, my pretty hat," said Sergeant Farrett, and shot from his car. She heard the car door slam, so turned on her heel and headed west towards the hill. Behind her, the bus roared away, the tail lights shrinking, but she could hear the footsteps approaching. Myrtle Dunnage, my. Myrtle quickened her pace. So did Sergeant Farrett. He inspected her fine boots. Italian, he wondered, and her trousers, definitely not serge. "Myrtle, let me help you." She walked on, so the sergeant lunged, wrenching the domed box from her hand, spinning her around. They stood and stared at each other, the white air swirling around them. Tilly had grown into a woman, while Sergeant Farrett had aged. And we know that since Tilly has left the town and returned, she's obviously experienced a lot of the world. She's a really well-travelled woman. And Sergeant Farrett, who has stayed in the town, is obviously aged. Now, he raised one pale hand to his mouth in embarrassment, then shrugged and headed for his car with the luggage. When he'd thrown the last of Myrtle's suitcases onto the back seat, he opened the passenger door for her and waited. And when she was in, he swung the car about and headed east. "We'll take the long way home," he said, and the knot in the pit of Tilly's stomach hardened. And we get this continual reference to Tilly and how she's feeling. Potentially, it's guilt. It, as we know, we'll find out later on in a text, but it does refer to when she left the town. Now, they glided through the fog, and as they rounded the football oval, Sergeant Farrett said, "We're third from the top of the ladder this year." And Tilly was silent. "You've come from Melbourne, have you?" "Yes," she answered flatly. "Home for long?" "Not sure." They drove back through the main street. When they passed the school hall, she heard the childhood cries of Friday afternoon softball games and shrieks and splashes from the swimming carnivals at the creek. When Sergeant Farrett turned the library corner towards the hill, she smelled the library's waxed lino floor and saw a flash of wet blood on the dry grass outside. Memories of being driven to the bus stop all those years ago by the same man rose up, and the knot once again in her stomach turned. Again, this idea that she had an unhappy childhood. Finally, the police car ground its way to the top of the hill and stopped. She sat looking at her old home while the sergeant looked at her. Little Myrtle Dunnage had alabaster skin and her mother's eyes and hair. She seemed strong, but damaged, and I've made the point there to suggest that is because or comes from a vengeful community. "Does anyone know you're coming, Myrtle?" asked the sergeant. "My name is Tilly," she said. "Everyone will know soon enough." Again, this idea, it's quite an insular community. Everyone talks to everyone. She turned to look at Sergeant Farrett's expectant face in the foggy moonlight. "How is my mother?" she asked. He opened his car door. "Your mother doesn't get out these days," he said, and climbed from the car. The fog resting around the veranda moved like frills on a skirt as the sergeant moved through it with Tilly's suitcases. He held the heavy dome. "You've a lovely sewing machine, Tilly," he said. "I'm a seamstress and dressmaker, Sergeant Farrett." She opened the back door. He clapped his hands. "Excellent." "Thanks for the lift." She closed the back door on him. And as he drove away, Sergeant Farrett tried to remember the last time he'd visited Mad Molly. He hadn't seen her for at least a year, but knew that May McSweeney kept an eye on her. He smiled. A dressmaker. Molly's house was dank and smelled like possum piss. Tilly felt along the dusty wall for the light switch and turned it on, then moved through the kitchen to the lounge room, past the crusty old lounge suite to the fireplace. She put her hand to the ash. It was stone cold. She made her way over to her mother's bedroom door, turned the knob and pushed. A dull lamp glowed in the corner by the bed. "Mum?" A body stirred under piled blankets. A skeleton head wearing a tea cosy turned on a grubby kapok pillow. The mouth gaped like a charcoal hole, and sunken eyes gazed at her. Molly Dunnage, mad woman and crone, said to her daughter, "You've come about the dog, have you? You can't have him. We want to keep him." She gestured at a crowd of invisible people around her bed. "Don't we?" she nodded at them. "This is what they've done to you," said Tilly. A mitten stiff and soiled came from under the blankets. Milly looked at her skinny wrist. 4:30, she said. So again here we have this idea, we have this description of Molly as being a mad woman, and Tilly says this is what they've done to you. She blames the town for how her mother has turned out. And we'll get more information on that later on. So Tilly unpacked the bottle of brandy she'd bought for her mother and sat on the back veranda, looking down at the dull forms of Dungatar at slumber. And continually, because she's on the hill, she's continually looking down on the citizens and the townspeople of Dungatar. She wondered about what she had left behind her and what she had returned to. At dawn, she sighed and raised the glass to the small grey town and went inside. She evicted snug families of mice from between the towels in the linen press, and spiders from their lace homes under light shades. She swept dust, dirt, twigs, and a dead sparrow from the bath, and turned the taps on to scrub it. The water ran cold and brown, and when it flowed clear and hot, she filled the bath, then added lavender flowers from the garden. She tugged her mother from her crusty bed, and pulled her tottering towards the bath. Mad Molly cursed, scratched and punched Tilly with daddy long legs limbs, but soon tied and folded easily into the water. "Anyway," she snapped, "everyone knows red jelly stays harder longer," and she cackled at Tilly with green gums and lunatic eyes. "Give me your teeth," said Tilly. Molly clamped her mouth shut. Tilly pressed Molly's forearms across her chest, pinning her, then pinched her nostrils until Molly opened her mouth to breathe. She prized her teeth open with a spoon and dropped them into a bucket of ammonia. Molly yelled and thrashed about until she was exhausted and clean, and while she soaked, Tilly stripped the beds. When the sun was high, she dragged the mattresses out onto the grass to bake. Later, she tucked Molly's scrawny frame back into bed and spooned her sweet black tea, talking to her all the while. Molly's answers were maniacal, angry, but answers just the same, and then she slept. So Tilly cleaned out the stove, gathered kindling from the garden and lit a fire. Smoke ballooned up the chimney, and a possum in the roof thumped across the beams. She threw open all the doors and windows and started flinging things out. An ancient sewing machine and a moth-eaten dress stand, a Ringer washing machine shell, old newspapers and boxes, dirty curtains and stiff carpet pieces, a couch and its ruined chairs, broken tables, empty tin cans and glass bottles. Soon, the little weatherboard house stood stump deep in rubbish. Tilly here is cleaning out her old home, which has been left in an unkempt state by Mad Molly, her mother. And we get this idea of cleaning and washing herself and ridding herself of the past. Now, when Molly woke, Tilly walked her all the way down to the outhouse, where she sat on the toilet with her bloomers around her ankles and the nightie tucked up into her jumper. She tied her hands to the toilet door with her dressing gown cord so that she would not wander off. Molly bellowed at the top of her old lungs until she was hoarse. And later, Tilly heated tinned tomato soup and sat her mother in the sun, emptied, cleaned and wrapped in jumpers, gloves, cap, socks, slippers and blankets, and fed her. All the while, Mad Molly prattled. Tilly wiped her mother's sauce-red mouth. "Did you enjoy that?" Her mother replied formally, "Yes, thank you, we always do," and smiled graciously to the others attending the banquet before vomiting over the strange woman she thought was feeding her poison. Again, Tilly stood on the veranda, the breeze pressing her trousers against her slim legs. Below her, smoke circled from beneath a copper in the McSweeney's yard at the base of the hill beside the tip. Strangers assumed the bent railway carriages and dented caravans were part of it, but it was where the McSweeney family lived. Edward McSweeney was Dungatar's night cartman. What that means is pretty much he collects the sewerage. and they are of a lower class. In fact, they are the lowest class in the society, are the McSweeney family. And look at where they live. They live in railway carriages and dented caravans. Now, Edward McSweeney, he could negotiate every outhouse, every full dun he can in Dungatar, even on the blackest, windiest nights, without spilling a drop. During the day, he also delivered things, riding around on his cart with his middle son, Barney, and a bunch of kids hanging off the back. So while he is of the lower class, he is an extremely valuable member of the society, even if he's not respected by those above him. Now, little Myrtle used to watch the McSweeney kids playing. The oldest boy, a few years younger than herself, then 3 girls, and Barney, who was not quite finished. He was crooked with an upside-down head and a club foot. The town itself rested in the full glare of the morning sun. The railway station and the square grey silo sat along the railway line, whose arc held the buildings against the bend of the Dungatar Creek, like freckles on a nose. The creek had always been low, chocked with willows and cambudgy weed, the flow sluggish and the water singing with mosquitoes. The pioneer founders of Dungatar had allowed a floodplain along its inner curve, which was now a park of sorts, with a community hall in the middle. Mr. and Mrs. Almanac's low damp cottage at the eastern end, opposite their chemist shop, and the school at the western edge, where Prudence Dim had taught the children of Dungatar for as long as anyone could remember. We get this idea of a community that is quite stagnant, so the creek and the water doesn't flow, and the teacher has been there for as long as anyone can remember. The main road followed the curve of the park, separating it from the commercial strip. The police station was situated out along the road to the east, halfway between the cemetery and the town's edge. It was not a busy road, and there were few shops at its curb. The chemist shop, then the station hotel, and then A&M Pratt Merchant Supplies, a general store which sold everything anyone needed. The post office, bank and telephone exchange were housed together in the next building, and the last most western building was the Shire office and library combined. The houses of Dungatar, dotted behind the commercial strip, were dissected by a thin gravel road that ran to the football oval. The green eye of the oval looked back up at Tilly, the cars around its edge like lashes. Inside, her mother stirred and called, and the possum thumped across the ceiling again. Tilly went to the dress stand lying on the grass. She stood it up and then hosed it down, leaving it to dry in the sun. We get a really good description of the town here as well. Again, it's meant to symbolise any old country town back in 1950s Australia. A couple of shops, a few houses, but a really small town. And we can see and make some comparisons to Salem in the Crucible as well, in terms of the fact that it is a small town, small community, where everyone sort of plays their role. And we know as both the play and the text progress, that the conflict within the town starts to deteriorate that sense of community and togetherness. So let's look at some key quotations from chapter 1. The knot in the pit of Tilly's stomach tightened, this idea of blame and guilt, and that gets repeated throughout this chapter, how she's feeling. A nice descriptive quote to describe Tilly is the fact that she seems strong but damaged, and we know that something has happened to her in the past, but the fact that she was strong for it. This is what they've done to you. Tilly blames the town for who her mother has become, namely Mad Molly, with which she is referred to by a number of the citizens. And the last quotation: a shaky beacon in a vast black sea, the hill casts a shadow over the town. It's a great description to describe both the Dunnage girls and their house and their position in the community. And that's all for chapter 1. Join us next time as we go through some more key chapters from the Dressmaker.